In a courtroom where every word counts, one of the most powerful judges in the country sets his sights on an unlikely target, Denzel Washington. What begins as a routine legal discussion quickly spirals into a high-stakes challenge as the judge tries to embarrass the legendary actor with tough questions. But as the tension builds, a surprising twist leaves everyone speechless. Can a Hollywood icon outsmart a top legal mind? Stay tuned to see how the unexpected unfolds. In a large courtroom where history often met justice, a major event was about to unfold. At the center of it stood one of the most powerful figures in the judicial system, someone known for strong opinions and a commanding presence. His name carried weight across the country. People knew him for being serious, disciplined, and at times intimidating. Those who stood before him often prepared long in advance, expecting sharp questions and very little patience. On that particular day, the courtroom was filled with people waiting to witness something unusual. It was not a typical case or hearing. Instead, it was a special event where the judge had invited someone from outside the legal world to speak. This person was famous for achievements in a different field, one unrelated to law or politics. The judge introduced the guest with formal language, but there was a noticeable tone in his voice, one that suggested he didn't take the guest too seriously. As the event started, the judge decided to take control of the conversation. He began asking questions, not regular questions that helped move the discussion forward, but questions designed to challenge, confuse, and maybe even embarrass the guest. The audience could sense it. The judge leaned into his reputation for being clever and tough, and he used that moment to put the guest on the spot. He asked things that required deep legal understanding. He brought up sections of the Constitution, past Supreme Court rulings, and complicated policy decisions. The way he asked the questions was not neutral. There was a clear motive behind them. Each question was wrapped in a tone of doubt, almost, suggesting that the guest didn't belong there or didn't deserve to speak on matters of law. The people in the room started reacting. Some whispered, some chuckled softly. They believed the judge was showing how authority works, how someone who has spent years in the legal system could easily outsmart someone from the outside. It felt like a performance, not just a discussion. The judge wanted to prove a point, that legal knowledge is not something anyone can just speak about, especially not someone who wasn't trained in it. But this wasn't just about asking difficult questions. There was more behind the judge's actions. He seemed to want to protect the seriousness of the court, to guard it against what he may have seen as public influence or celebrity. He believed perhaps that legal matters should be left to those who had earned the right to speak through study and long careers in the justice system. And so, by putting pressure on the guest, he thought he was protecting the dignity of the court. Still, it wasn't just about dignity. There was a subtle but real desire to bring the guest down a notch. Maybe he had seen the guest's speeches or public appearances and found them too bold. Maybe he didn't like the idea that someone outside the legal world could speak with confidence about serious topics like justice, fairness, or the Constitution. So he used his position, his voice, and his authority to control the stage and make the guest feel small. His body language supported this effort. He raised his eyebrows in disbelief. He gave quick, almost dismissive nods after the guest's first few responses. He interrupted, rephrased, and repeated questions with increasing complexity, making it clear that he expected the guest to stumble, and many in the room were ready to witness just that. A respected legal figure showing the limits of someone else's knowledge. This moment was crafted carefully. The judge, in front of a full courtroom and perhaps even cameras, took what should have been a respectful dialogue and turned it into a quiet contest. He had all the tools on his side: legal training, a deep understanding of courtroom rules, and the power to lead the conversation. He may have thought it would be quick, even easy. Ask a few difficult questions, get weak or confused answers, and then move on with a silent message sent to everyone watching, that the courtroom is no place for anyone but legal experts. Yet while he worked hard to challenge the guest, he didn't expect what would come next. But before that shift happened, everything about the moment showed one clear thing. A powerful judge had made a deliberate attempt to put someone in a difficult position, to expose weakness, and to draw a line between who deserves to speak in court and who doesn't. The effort to embarrass was not hidden. It was built into the way the questions were asked, the way the answers were received, and the way the entire room was made to watch. In the carefully arranged setting of the courtroom, the attention of everyone present was focused on the two individuals at the center of the room. One of them, known for wearing the black robe of authority, had spent decades studying and practicing law. His presence alone was enough to quiet any room. The other was a public figure, recognized not for legal work, but for contributions in a different part of society. When they met, it was clear from the start that this was not going to be an ordinary interaction. The judge, sitting high above the rest in his seat of power, had a goal in mind. It was more than just asking questions or hearing opinions. He wanted to do something more specific to embarrass the guest. This intention was not hidden. It was shown in how he structured the event, how he opened the conversation, and the tone he used throughout the exchange. From the moment the guest began speaking, the judge's body language showed doubt. His facial expressions hinted at disbelief, and his words carried sharp edges. He began by bringing up complex legal matters, some that even practicing attorneys struggle with. He recited parts of legal documents in a way that wasn't helpful but challenging. He asked the guest to explain decisions made in major court cases, and he questioned whether the guest understood the deeper meaning behind constitutional law. The phrasing of these questions was not supportive or educational. They were meant to test, corner, and confuse. This wasn't a discussion. It was a trap carefully designed by someone who knew the rules and had home field advantage. As the audience watched, the judge continued to press forward. He didn't ask open questions or give the guest space to share ideas. Instead, he interrupted often, corrected small word choices, and tried to catch every possible error. His tone was not aggressive, in volume but sharp in intention. It became clear that the judge believed the guest was out of place and needed to be reminded of that. It is important to understand that in a courtroom, the one in the robe holds more than just authority. They hold control. They decide who speaks, when, and for how long. This control, when used wisely, can create fairness. But in this situation, it was used with a different motive. The goal was not to explore truth, but to create discomfort. The judge used his position not just to challenge ideas, but to try and lower the respect others might have for the guest. Some in the room felt the tension rise. The questions were no longer about learning or testing knowledge. They became personal, in tone, as if meant to push the guest into a corner. The judge smiled at times, but the smile carried no kindness. Instead, it revealed a sense of control, as if everything was going according to plan. The guest was supposed to slip up, to show confusion, to be caught unprepared. That would give the judge exactly what he wanted. A chance to show the crowd that fame or intelligence from another field does not equal legal understanding. The judge, perhaps unknowingly, sent a message through his actions that only those trained in the strict world of law are allowed to speak with confidence in court. This belief guided his every word. It also caused him to ignore the possibility that the guest might actually know more than expected. Instead, he focused on exposing weakness. Each legal question became a tool to try and uncover a lack of understanding. Each reply was listened to with doubt, not curiosity. Even though the judge did not raise his voice, the pressure in the room was heavy. The silence between questions grew longer. The pauses were not respectful, they were tactical. They gave time for discomfort to grow. The audience could sense what was happening. This wasn't a conversation between equals, it was a performance of superiority. The judge, standing at the peak of the legal system, used the courtroom like a stage where he could try to take apart someone else's credibility. He underestimated what could happen next. In his effort to embarrass, he forgot that knowledge and insight are not always shown through traditional paths. He also overlooked the power of preparation, intellect, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. Still, in that moment, all his focus was on proving a point, that the courtroom belonged to the trained, the certified, and the experienced, and that anyone else could be easily put in their place with the right questions. As the questions grew more pointed and the tone more dismissive, the guest sat calmly, never showing signs of stress or frustration. The courtroom, once buzzing with quiet reactions and subtle laughter, began to sense a shift. Many had expected discomfort, perhaps even panic, but none of that appeared. Instead, the guest listened closely, took brief pauses before speaking, and responded with clarity and confidence. It was not the kind of calm that comes from ignoring pressure. It was the calm that comes from being fully prepared and mentally disciplined. When faced with complex legal questions, the guest didn't try to impress by using overly complicated language. Instead, every response was measured, thoughtful, and grounded in logic. Some in the room were surprised to hear clear explanations of court rulings, historical legal events, and constitutional ideas coming from someone they didn't expect it. There were moments when the judge, clearly pushing harder, asked multi-part questions that touched on legal philosophy and past precedents. But the guest handled each one without raising a voice or showing any irritation. The guest broke down the questions, answered them in order, and even offered short examples to support each point. The words used weren't just correct, they were purposeful. Every answer showed not only a strong understanding of the topic, but also an ability to communicate it clearly. That composure stood in contrast to the judge's increasingly impatient tone. The more the guest maintained steady control, the more it seemed the judge became uncomfortable with the lack of reaction. He had likely hoped for signs of nervousness, shaky hands, unsure words, or misstatements, but they never came. Instead, the guest stayed seated with the same posture, the same quiet confidence, and the same respectful tone from beginning to end. This behavior taught the audience a powerful lesson. Many had assumed that someone without formal legal training would not be able to engage in a serious legal discussion, especially not in the presence of one of the highest judicial figures in the country. But by staying composed and responding with substance, the guest showed that real knowledge does not always require credentials. It requires understanding, patience, and the ability to think under pressure. Every time the judge interrupted or challenged a response, the guest didn't argue or become defensive. Instead, there was a pause, a nod, and then a continuation, always bringing the focus back to the topic instead of getting lost in emotion. This kind of restraint was just as powerful as the content being spoken. It showed that control in communication can sometimes speak louder than titles or positions. Even when the judge tried to reframe earlier answers to trap the guest in contradiction, the replies remained steady. The guest clarified, reworded when necessary, and politely corrected the judge without ever appearing disrespectful. That balance, of being firm without being rude, was something even trained lawyers often struggled to achieve in a high-pressure environment. Yet here it was, demonstrated with ease in front of an audience that was slowly shifting from skepticism to respect. Observers began to see that the guest was not only knowledgeable, but also emotionally intelligent. There was no attempt to win over the crowd with charm or charisma. The focus remained on the subject matter: law, fairness, the role of courts, and the responsibilities of leaders. This seriousness gave weight to the guest's words and made it harder for anyone to dismiss the responses as simply clever talk. The mood in the courtroom changed slowly. The people who had expected to witness someone fail began to lean forward, interested. The chuckles faded. The silence between responses was no longer awkward. It became thoughtful. People began to realize that they weren't watching someone being embarrassed. They were watching someone defend ideas, speak with discipline, and challenge authority without ever crossing the line of disrespect. In staying calm, the guest didn't just avoid being embarrassed. They changed the direction of the event. The attempt to discredit turned into a platform for showing strength of character. In a space meant to highlight weakness, the guest revealed quiet power. It was a lesson in self-control, intelligence, and the ability to maintain one's voice, even when facing those in much higher positions of power. From the beginning of the exchange, it was clear that the judge believed he had the upper hand. He came into the courtroom with years of experience, deep legal knowledge, and the confidence that came from being at the top of the legal world. He had studied law, practiced it, and judged some of the most important cases in recent history. That kind of background often creates a sense of certainty, a belief that only those trained in the same way can fully understand or discuss the law. Because of this belief, The judge viewed the guest through a narrow lens. He expected limited knowledge, shallow opinions, and general ideas rather than specific legal reasoning. This underestimation shaped how the judge approached the conversation. He didn't just ask questions, he asked them in a way that assumed the guest wouldn't be able to answer correctly. He picked subjects that were known to be difficult, such as legal interpretation, constitutional clauses, and judicial ethics. These weren't questions meant for a general audience. They were the kind asked to experts during law exams or in high-level legal debates. The judge believed that the guest who came from outside the legal system wouldn't be able to follow, much less respond with authority. But that belief quickly began to unravel. As the guest began to answer, something unexpected happened. The responses weren't just clear, they were deeply informed. Legal terms were used accurately. Historical context was added where needed. Court decisions were mentioned with the correct dates and outcomes. The guest didn't just speak like someone who had read about the law casually. The guest spoke like someone who had studied its structure, its weaknesses, and its impact on society. At first, the judge showed signs of surprise, but he tried to hide it. He leaned forward, narrowed his eyes, and began to ask even tougher questions. He shifted the conversation to deeper legal theory, expecting the guest to stumble there. He brought up specific court cases that weren't widely discussed in public forums, thinking that these would surely expose a lack of knowledge. But again, the guest responded with accuracy and insight, drawing connections between past decisions and present issues. There was no confusion, no hesitation, only thoughtful replies that proved careful study and understanding. As the exchange continued, the judge's plan to catch the guest off guard started to collapse. The judge had built his questions on the belief that he was the only expert in the room. That belief was based on assumptions that someone from outside the legal profession couldn't possibly have the same level of insight. But that was a mistake. The guest had clearly done the work, perhaps in silence and without a public legal title, but with seriousness and dedication. What made this realization even more powerful was the way the guest explained things. Instead of using complex words or trying to sound overly technical, the guest broke things down so that everyone in the room could understand. This not only showed deep knowledge, but also the ability to teach, a quality often found in true experts. It became clear that the guest didn't just memorize legal points but actually understood the meaning and purpose behind them. The judge, still in control of the room, tried to maintain his position. He asked more questions, changed topics, and even returned to earlier points in hopes of finding a weak spot. But with each exchange, it became harder to deny what was happening. The person he had underestimated was not only holding steady, but leading parts of the discussion with ease. The courtroom was witnessing a shift in power, not through force but through knowledge and poise. This moment revealed something important about assumptions. Even those with great authority can be wrong when they judge someone based on background alone. The judge had not prepared for the possibility that the guest might actually be better read on certain legal subjects than many lawyers. That failure to recognize another person's potential caused him to miscalculate the entire situation. What was meant to be a demonstration of power turned into a lesson in humility. As others in the room noticed the judge's struggle to gain the upper hand, they too began to rethink their views. The idea that wisdom and legal insight can only come from certain schools, titles, or careers began to fade. The guest, simply by speaking clearly and correctly, challenged an entire mindset built around tradition and control. As the conversation continued in the courtroom, the attention of every person in the room became fixed on a single truth. Something unexpected was happening. What had started as a one-sided attempt to challenge, corner, and perhaps embarrass had turned into something entirely different. The guest, who had not been expected to hold their ground, was now answering each question with confidence, calmness, and clarity. The judge, once in full control, was no longer the only voice of authority in the room. This transformation wasn't loud or dramatic. It happened slowly, quietly, but with growing strength. The guest didn't argue, raise their voice, or try to outshine anyone. Instead, with every clear answer, with every thoughtful statement about the law, the Constitution, and past rulings, they began to earn the silent respect of the entire room. Each response added weight to their presence. Each point made with accuracy revealed a deep understanding that couldn't be ignored. What had been meant to be a test became a turning point. The courtroom, once filled with small smirks and quiet whispers at the judge's early remarks, grew silent. Not out of discomfort, but out of curiosity. People were no longer watching a person being questioned. They were watching someone command the space without needing a title or robe. Respect doesn't always have to be demanded. Sometimes it is earned through action, composure, and knowledge. That was what everyone was now witnessing. Even those who had doubted the guest's presence in the courtroom began to shift their opinions. It became hard to hold on to the belief that the guest didn't belong there. They had not only handled pressure, but they had also explained complex ideas with more clarity than most would expect, even from someone with formal legal training. People listened differently now. They leaned forward. Their expressions changed. Some even nodded quietly in agreement when the guest made a powerful or well-reasoned point. The judge, while still holding official control over the room, began to lose the silent support he had started with. His efforts to find flaws became more obvious, even forced. He returned to earlier points, tried to find weak spots in earlier answers, and occasionally shifted topics in hopes of catching the guest unprepared. But those moves no longer had the same effect. The balance of the conversation had changed. The courtroom was no longer reacting to the judge's questions. It was responding to the guest's answers. This shift wasn't just about who spoke better or who had more facts. It was about how each person behaved under pressure. The guest had faced an attempt to shame them in front of a crowd and had responded not with pride or anger, but with professionalism and reason. That kind of control left a lasting impression. It taught a lesson more powerful than any legal debate. It showed that dignity, discipline, and knowledge could speak louder than titles and tradition. People in the room began to recognize that expertise can take many forms. Sometimes it's earned in courtrooms and classrooms. Other times it's gained through years of careful reading, listening, and thinking. And when that kind of knowledge is presented with grace and strength, it can't be denied. The respect that filled the room was not forced. It was natural. It was the kind that grows when someone surprises expectations and shows that true brilliance doesn't need to shout to be heard. What had begun as an effort to highlight weakness ended with the discovery of unexpected strength. The guest, by simply answering truthfully and staying composed, had shown a level of insight that could not be overlooked. The courtroom no longer saw them as an outsider. They were now seen as someone who had something valuable to say, someone who had earned their place not through authority, but through action. In that moment, the power of perception changed. The guest had redefined what it meant to be respected in that room. It wasn't about the chair you sat in, the robe you wore, or the years behind your name. It was about how you carried yourself when others tried to shake your ground. And for everyone who witnessed that transformation, the message was clear. Respect is not given, it is earned, and when it is earned honestly, even the most powerful must recognize it.